We are definitely into the middle of our exploration of relationships. This is the third of, I'm pretty sure, 5. Yeah. And Scott, we've heard about Zizulas and the idea of being as communion, and we've talked about intimate relationships. And now today we're going to hear from Dr. Scott Bader-Saye, our academic dean, talk to us about the bonds of affection. So please welcome Scott.
Thank you, Micah. I wanted to talk about bonds of affection because the other relationships we're talking about, Trinitarian relationships and intimate relationships, mentoring, friendship, all involve a level of closeness and intentionality that are really important, but not every relationship we're a part of has that kind of closeness and intentionality. And essentially what I want to make a case for is that there is a valuable place for the types of relationships that stand in between those who are strangers to us and those who are close to us. And I think the language of affection helps us name that in between, and to say not only that it's important that these relationships exist, but that they are worth nurturing in their own particular way. So that's what we'll be up to with this. And I want to start actually with a little piece of video from Crack. So Cheadle's giving a diagnosis of LA, but in some ways it could be a diagnosis of any number of places. How would you put in your words what he just diagnosed? What would you say he's noticing about contemporary culture, or specifically to this moment, LA culture?
We're isolated and we don't like it, but we don't know we don't like it.
Yeah. We're isolated, we don't like it, we don't know we don't like it. What else do you notice as diagnosis coming out of this?
So we sort of need contact with each other, but we avoid it for different reasons.
Good, yeah.
I think too that we'll go to the extreme to even harm ourselves or others in order to get it before we realize there's easier ways to go about it.
Yeah, that's good. That's good, right? So we'll go to an extreme to get that contact. Before we know there are easier ways. And notice the leap he makes between the image of, in any other city, he says, you walk, you brush past people. Notice that imagery of touch, right? And that's how he starts out, is the sense of touch. We don't have that. And he's not talking about intimate touch. He's talking about brushing up against others. And that's what he thinks is missing. We don't brush up against people. We're behind our steel and glass, we're in our cars, we just move from space to space, but we don't brush up against others. And so you notice there's this huge leap between we don't brush up and therefore we smash into each other. Right? He doesn't say let's find a nice in between. It's just if we can't have this, we move straight to crashing. And it's an interesting kind of diagnosis, I think, not just about LA or cities like that are very much created and constructed around driving in cars versus public transport or walking the streets. I think it's a diagnosis also of just where we are culturally and the many different ways that our lives get sealed off from each other. Not necessarily sealed off from intimate relationships. We still find those. Not sealed off from family, and not even necessarily sealed off from finding friendships, so that may be a little harder for some people than it used to be. But we're sealed off from that sense of touch. We're sealed off from brushing up against others. And when I hear that, when I think about that diagnosis, what I think is he is diagnosing the loss of the context within which relationships of affection might emerge. So that's what I want to kind of explore in this next little bit. The Anglican Communion uses this language. So we talk about bonds of affection holding us together. It is, at times, it feels like language that might be a bit empty. So it might be a way of saying, well, we haven't got this, we haven't got that, but at least we've got some bonds of affection. And then when we try to define them, we're not exactly sure what it means. There are other times I think we use the language and we can point to some things, right? We create opportunities to brush up against each other, whether it's a Lambeth Council or other gatherings where we bring together people from around the communion. We create space to brush up against one another. We have historic ties that don't link us through a set hierarchy. They don't link us through any kind of administrative unity. But we have brushed up against one another long enough that we respect something of the relationship that has emerged, even among those of us who really are strangers to us. So sometimes bonds of affection involves an act of the imagination. I have come to see myself, I construe myself as part of this whole. I construe myself as having affection for other people within this whole, even though I may never have met them. I develop a certain kind of affection because I know we share some things in common. So at its best, this language describes something healthy about this wide universal church where we try to imagine our connectedness with one another. I want to suggest also, though, that it can say something about smaller relationships, that it says something even about our local embodiments of church as well. So I want to get at a little bit this, what affection is in relation to other kinds of loves. And if you'll see, I'm drawing on C.S. Lewis's really nice book on the four loves. And Lewis sets out agape, philia, eros, and storge, these four Greek terms for love, and explores them one by one throughout the book. Agape is one that we probably all know and have talked about and have discussed in class. Right? This is a kind of love that the New Testament describes specifically as divine love, as well as the kind of love Jesus calls us into, very much shaped by gift and grace. Friendship, philia, is another love that is often talked about. In fact, especially now in the church, there's a lot of conversation about construing church as a community of friends, or construing mission and missional work as the building of friendships. So friendship is getting a lot of play in theological conversations, ecclesiological conversations. Eros, again, Eros is certainly over the past few decades, there's been a huge recovery of the language of desire and the significance of desire in Christian theology. We're trying to rediscover the significance of this and why it's important that we affirm the reality of ourselves as desiring creatures and not simply see desire as something threatening. So the first three of these loves have come in for a lot of attention, both historically and in contemporary conversation. The fourth of these, how many of you have seen articles written on storge? Not so many. Maybe just one. Maybe just one. Yeah, probably right. So affection is in many ways the sort of lonely stepchild of the four loves. And one of the things that Lewis does in this book that I think is so nice is he helps us understand why affection matters. Why even put this one into play? The New Testament doesn't talk about storge. It's not a love that's gotten a lot of love. So why spend time looking at it? Lewis says this. He says, affection is indeed the least discriminating of loves. Almost anyone can become an object of affection. There need be no apparent fitness between those whom it unites. Affection can rub along with the most unpromising people. Yet, oddly enough, this very fact means that it can, in the end, make appreciations possible, which, but for it, might never have existed. So notice the progression in this paragraph, how he moves through, right? We begin with being the least discriminating. Think about what friendship requires. Friendship requires some sort of shared interest, shared passions. Aristotle said a true friendship involves a shared sense of your telos, and therefore a shared desire to live a life of virtue. And along with that, then Aristotle said, it follows that you're not going to have a lot of friends. You're going to have a handful of friends. You're going to find a few people who can share that journey toward virtue with you. And it's going to take time and it takes investment in those people. You've got to actually spend time with each other, which means that even just as a pragmatic matter, you can't have a whole bunch of friends. At least not true friends in the sense that Aristotle was talking about it there. Friendship is discriminating. Right? You need to find somebody with whom you share some things in common. Eros is certainly discriminating. You really need to find someone with whom you bond in an intimate way. Affection, least discriminating of the loves. And I think that's part of why we might spend the least amount of time talking about it and thinking about it, but in another way it's the great advantage of affection. Because you can develop affection for those with whom you share very little in common. You can develop affection for those you don't really like very much. Those who do not share your vision of the telos, who are not going to be building you up in the virtues because you may not even really have agreement about the virtues that you want to be built up in. But here we've got this sort of relational term that helps us describe something that is more than being strangers to one another. It's maybe less than being friends or romantic partners with one another. But it carves out this in-between space. And what happens if we carve out that space? Well, we may not have any fitness, but if we can rub along with these unpromising people, as Lewis calls them, and notice the imagery here, right? It's like the language from Crash, right? Rubbing up along people who are different, these unpromising people, right? But here's the key, I think, to this whole paragraph. This very fact means that it can, in the end, make appreciations possible that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. I wouldn't have gotten to know this other well enough to appreciate something about them because I just wouldn't have been drawn to them initially. So appreciations arise because we have both been in proximity with one another, but also in such a way that we've attended, right? We've paid some attention to one another. Just enough that we can begin over time to develop an appreciation for what they have to give, to gift us. So then one more paragraph from Lewis. Lewis precedes this by talking about the person who has wide literary taste can wander up to a shelf at a used bookstore and find something to like. So then he builds off of that analogy, and he says, the truly wide taste in humanity will find something to appreciate in the cross-section of humanity whom one has to meet every day. And notice that, one has to meet every day. We're going to some extent, bump up against this wide cross-section of humanity. In my experience, it is affection that creates this taste, teaching us first to notice, then to endure, then to smile at, then to enjoy, and finally to appreciate the people who happen to be there. And again, right, he sort of lists out this movement of, and I appreciate that he says endure, that this is part of it, okay? Part of it is we come to endure these people. I remember, and you can probably think of people like this, I remember folks from churches that I've been a part of in the past, and maybe they're sort of curmudgeonly, and you know, they're sort of naysayers, and they're like, oh, okay, they showed up at this meeting, so you know, you're ready for it to be a harder meeting than it might have been otherwise. But over time, you discover some things about them that even the curmudgeon, right, and that term itself sort of suggests the possibility of affection, right? Not just jerk. You know, the person's not a jerk, they're a curmudgeon. And if you're a jerk, it's hard to think, you know, how do you move from that person being a jerk to having affection? But if you say, well, yeah, this guy's a curmudgeon, then what you're saying is, like, I'm leaving open some room for affection to happen here. Even though they sort of rub me wrong sometimes. But the point of having that intentionality of leaving open room for affection is that it opens this possibility to enjoy and appreciate those whom we are in some ways stuck with. And so this is the piece that I think Lewis brings up about affection that to me is so helpful and makes it worth paying attention to. And not only paying attention to as a concept or as a theological idea, but paying attention to it as something that's worth nurturing. It's worth spending some time on. The other person I've turned to recently in thinking about affection is Wendell Berry. He uses the language of affection in a number of his essays but it made its way into the title of the Jefferson lecture that he gave a few years ago. The National Endowment for the Humanities invites in one person a year to give the Jefferson lecture. So it's a pretty big honor. I'm not sure they knew what they were getting into when they invited Wendell Berry. If you read the full text of this, you'll see that, as usual, he decided to make trouble. But the title is It All Turns on Affection. It all turns on affection. So Barry, and the lecture that he gives really bears this out. Affection isn't the least of the loves. In fact, so much of life going well with us and with one another has to do with building affection. And maybe it all turns on affection. At least that's the claim that he wants to make. Now, if you know Wendell Berry, you know that he's very interested in environmental issues. He's sort of he's a farmer, philosopher, poet, essayist, novelist. You know, he's sort of got the whole thing going there. But in many ways, you know, his poetry, his essays, his novels all come back around to what he learns from being a farmer, from being connected to land and people and community. That goes with his experience of being a farmer and being part of a family of farmers. So here's a little bit of what he said in this lecture. He gives a certain diagnosis of what he sees going on in the culture around him, and he names it as limitlessness. So he says, no doubt there will always be some people willing to do anything at all that is economically or technologically possible, who look upon the world and its creatures without affection, and therefore as exploitable without limit. So notice the connection there. It is precisely because we have no affection for the land or for other people that makes us, that allows us to take a posture of an unlimited kind of exploitation that can happen, right? I'm free to use them up because I don't have a fundamental affection for them. Against that limitlessness in which we foresee assuredly our ruin, we have only our ancient effort to define ourselves as human and humane. And so you can see how the language of human and humane connects to the language of affection here. What makes us humane is that we are capable of affection. Affection for one another, for other creatures, affection for the land, affection for air and water. Again, that's part of what makes affection such an interesting term, such an interesting description of love, because we can talk about having affection for the land in a way that you might not talk about eros or philia, right? You don't have a friendship with the land exactly, but you can have affection for the land. And in fact, Barry thinks it's crucial that we pay attention to how we nurture that kind of affection. He goes on then and suggests a cure. And I've named this cure proximity, even though it's not, that specific word isn't in here.
I want to know that I heard you right before you go.
Yeah.
So he says you can't have friendship with the land, and that's because the land and I don't have the same telos.
I imposed that.
You read it that way?
So that's why,
No,
yeah. So he doesn't specifically say that you can't have these others, but it seems to me he opts for the language of affection because, at least in its traditional language, friendship, exactly, it requires a movement of two of us toward a shared telos, and our telos and the land's telos are not the same.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to make sure I heard that.
Yeah.
So this is accessible. Affection is accessible between the land and human.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas others may not.
Right.
Okay, Chase, I just believe.
Yeah, so then when he later in the essay suggests a kind of cure, or at least one possibility, he says this: the effort to build or rebuild local economies, starting with economies of food, intends to bring producers and consumers causes and effects back within the bounds of neighborhood, which is to say the effective reach of imagination, sympathy, affection, and all else that neighborhood implies. So he's connecting the language of affection now with the proximity of neighborhood. And if we can bring these things back together, not only can we develop affection for one another and for the land, but also he connects imagination and sympathy to this same necessary movement of proximity. So affection grows out of that, but tied up in affection is my capacity to have sympathy, or we might use the language of empathy, all right, to be able to place myself in the shoes of another. Affection is the extension of ourselves towards someone else that allows us entree to that sort of imagination. What would it be like to be in their life, to live in their shoes, to somehow see the world through their eyes? And until we look at one another with affection, it's very hard to also provoke that kind of imagination and that sort of sympathy. Given the way that many of us have been thinking about the significance of proximity since Brian Stevenson's talk, it struck me that this is just another way of talking about that. The way Barry talks about neighborhood is really just a way of saying we need to be drawn into proximity, because if you never have it, it's hard to build affection. And then we're right back to Don Cheadle and Crash and being inside our glass and our metal, and we don't touch. We don't rub up against one another, right? It defeats proximity. So, affection then, we've talked about needing proximity. We've talked about being a kind of love that opens us onto the capacity to have sympathy and imagination. It allows us to enter into a kind of relationship even with land, topsoil, water, such that we can attend to it in a way that we don't use it up, assuming we can have a limitless posture toward it. The question though remains, how do I move beyond just being in proximity to actually nurturing affection? Because it's also possible, and many of us know this from our own neighborhoods, it's possible to be in proximity with people and never really build affection. Because we're physically near, but we really still rarely find the opportunity to even get to know one another at the basic level that we can imaginatively begin to enter into what's their life like. So it involves a certain intentionality as well. It's not just enough to be near. You need to be near in a certain kind of way where you're choosing to enter into the experience of the others who are nearby. This little clip I want to show you is from David Foster Wallace's now very famous commencement address from Kenyon College back in 2005. The address was widely hailed right after he gave it for being something just fresh in the midst of commencement speeches. He actually managed to say something different and not simply tell them to go set the world on fire, whatever the great phrase of the day was. But one thing he does at this point in the lecture, and you're going to hear David Foster Wallace's voiceover on the video. One thing he does at this point is he's telling the students to prepare themselves for certain aspects of adult life that kind of suck. I mean, there's no better way to put it. As you enter into adult life, it means you're going to experience things like really long, stinking commutes, where you like sit in your car and get angry at people. You're going to experience the frustrations of being in the grocery store, and you really need to get through quickly, and there are people in your way, and you're standing in line, and the line next to you is moving faster than yours is. You're going to have to deal with a bunch of stuff in your grown-up life that's just like very pedestrian stuff that gets in your way, makes you frustrated, but can actually ruin your day. So part of growing up into adult life and coming out of college and getting a job and taking on all of those things is figuring out, what am I going to do with that part of grown-up life? These like really tedious responsibilities that come with just being on our own and taking care of ourselves. And so this is the point where we're cutting into the speech as he's beginning to tell them, look, there are certain things about growing up into being an adult that are really going to stink, and it's going to be really important that you know how to attend to these things in the right way, or else they're going to make you mad and frustrated every single day. Right? And so I hear this, he never mentions the word affection, but I hear this as a description of the kind of intentionality we would need if we wanted to build affection within contexts of proximity that are really not set up for it, like rush hour traffic and standing in line in the grocery store. Right? So this is about a 3-minute clip.
That's bad. Where can we hear the whole thing?
YouTube.
It's on YouTube?
Yeah.
So I want to pause because I think this is so great. I just want to pause and get feedback. Any thoughts from David Foster Wallace's words in relation to what we've been talking about regarding affection. What does it bring up for you? How does it feel intriguing or challenging for you?
What it brought up for me was how annoyance can be like the moth and the light, and how the light, draws the moth, in and in and in and in, and how annoyance can do that with us, and how we're a little bit annoyed, and then we get a little more annoyed, and then more annoyed, and just really lost into that thing that's annoying us, to all of a sudden, we're in this, dark place, and how it's our own weakness that leads to feeding into the annoyance when there's all kinds of other ways to deal with it that are or leads you to a better place.
Yeah.
The proximity, it led me to think of Stephen's Sowing Holy Questions article, where so he had that proximity, and he made the choice to choose affection to the fellow traveler, right? And so, I don't know if y'all read it, if you read it, it's really great. And so, and I think what also it seems to me is that it points out our own minuscule judgmental, right? So you make these, visually, you make these judgments on all these people, right? It's laid all this, we all do. We all lay judgments on people, right? That person, as he sort of said in this piece, right? And choosing not to be open, or it's your perception, right? Like, I mean, we've all been annoyed standing in line, but the line takes 10 to 20 minutes, and other parts of the country, it'll take all day to get, a cup of rice. Or some clean water. So, it's that perception. Like, I remember somebody was complaining about the parking here. I was like, I'm sorry, I used to have to park at Breckenridge, so you have no concept about it. It was a daily chore to not let that 30 minutes in the Breckenridge garage suck your joy. And you had to hold on tight. I mean, I saw a volunteer one time lose it on another person for their shift, and so then we had to talk to that volunteer, like, you can't flip off people in the garage. And so like they chose to let that anger, right, and so then they lost their affection. It also seemed to me, I was reading something the other day, random affection seems to have a lot of impact. So whether you see those Facebook stories about some little girl was having to fly on a flight with her dad, and the dad arranged for everybody on the plane to give her treats, and she trick-or-treated down the flight out. Right? Or a little girl was sort of obsessed with this older man, and so they began this friendship who lived across the street, and how meaningful it was to him. So whether or not you get the hug and a kiss from your spouse, and that's important and wide open. Sometimes it's the randomness that can have more impact.
Yeah, that's good.
I thought it was actually the default button. The default button?
Yeah.
And I think that's, what is my default button? Is my default button frustration, annoyance, I'm the center of the world, move out of my way? Or is my default button compassion, patience, understanding? And that's a choice. And that, what do we say, pattern, action, behavior, yes, develop that. So that means that our behavior will set this default button. And so if we're attentive to that we are creating a default button. And so what default button am I creating?
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. So thinking about how habituation can change the default. And over time you can create a different default.
Yeah.
Nathan?
I think it made me think about, I think I've been changing a lot recently. I think I used to think of the difference between being annoyed and hateful rather than having the virtue of charity and love was this kind of just a simple replacement project. I just needed to have one habit replaced by another one that was better. And I think, I might be wrong, but at least where I am right now is that what this was really bringing up to me was practices of meditation, and what a lot of people, I mean, it's kind of popular today, but it's still pretty cool. There's a mindfulness practice is that I don't know if in this life we ever have a different default life. But it's just about setting up those practices and those disciplines where at least we're aware of it, so that new choices can arise. So I'm starting to cut myself a little slack. Like maybe I'm never going to have that much charity as a habit. But maybe what I can have is enough prayer and meditation and mindfulness and self-awareness that every now and then there'll be enough space for the Holy Spirit to be charitable through me, despite my default setting. You know, and
Maybe salvation's not any bigger work than that.
yeah, that's right.
Tony, what were you gonna add?
So two things I'm thinking about. One is, there's a really brilliant Dante reference going on there that's got my head spinning. But the other thing is, the way that he worked with certainty and reality. Like, that's a really interesting way of framing that habit of mind. What you are right there is you are certain that you know what the reality is. And what if you asked yourself different questions, or you let yourself explore new possibilities? These probably aren't even true. But what happens to your sense of reality if you wonder if they might be? You know, that's really fascinating.
Yeah, I love the way that connects back with Barry's reference to imagination.
Yes.
So that, you know, he's calling us into an act of imagination. What if, you know, imagine what might be true of this person's world. Their world is probably at least as complex and frustrating and difficult as your own, maybe more so.
Right.
Just to let yourself imagine. Again, probably you're not going to imagine what's exactly true about that person, but just to let yourself imagine what are the things that have gone on in their day, what's happening in their life that makes them this way or that way. You know, I try that when people cut me off on I-35, and still not very good at it, but you know, it does, right? It does keep you at least from, after you've had your initial default setting reaction, then to be able to engage some active imagination around that person's world. It can change. It changes.
It changes the story we're telling ourselves about that person.
Yeah. Nice Brene Brown reference. I like that.
Right.
Yeah. Changes the story we're telling ourselves. So I thought we could just finish our conversation by opening it up to the question of how does affection affect any of these different areas? We don't have to go through them one by one, but just thinking about if we become people who are attentive about building relationship of affection, how might it impact these different aspects of our lives? And I'll just to give you one example that, you know, maybe, well, we'll pick economy because this will explain the photo that I chose, which is now gone. That was weird. Hey, when are we going to get a new setup in here? Just imagine that picture's still up there. That was thankfully my last slide. You know I'll have it imprinted upon your brain. So, so the photo was of Mary Telly, who is the owner and operator of Electric City Roasting, which is a roasting company in Scranton, Pennsylvania that produces fantastic coffee. And I got to know her when I lived there. She also ran a coffee shop that was near the roaster. And I just began by talking to her in the coffee shop and getting to know what she does and asking her, you know, hey, do you have any fair trade coffee? And she said, no, we don't do fair trade coffee. And I thought, oh, okay, slacker, you know. But then, you know, it turns out then my initial failure at affection was replaced because it was also a failure of imagination. She works with local farmers to directly trade with them. So instead of working through a mediator who buys and sells, and then, with fair trade, you tack X amount on top. And that's just basically what counts as fair trade now. She creates direct relationships with coffee growers in particular communities, especially in Central America. She goes down there, spends time with them, talks to them, not only about what's going on in their lives, but she helps them become better coffee growers so that she can then sell coffee for the price that it takes to pay them fairly for what they do. But if she's going to do that, she's got to produce excellent coffee. So she helps them grow excellent beans, then she roasts them and sells them, and many of her clients are New York City restaurants, and she sells some really high-end coffee. She can do that because she's involved in the process from start to finish, right? And that involves building relationships and becoming connected with the people she's working with.
So you had shared interest around that. Is that friendship or is that affection?
I think it was affection, because we didn't sustain an ongoing relationship where we helped one another become more virtuous. We just ran into each other periodically at the coffee shop and knew that we had a connection in something we were interested in. But it didn't mean that's what we talked about every time. Sometimes we just shoot the breeze or talk about, what's going on in your day, the amount of time it takes you to get a cup of coffee forward and go back to your seat. So it had never moved to a level of great depth. But it showed me something about how her relationship of affection that extended out to lots of different people in the coffee making process created a different kind of economic system as well, right? A different little economic ecosystem for her business. So it seems to me that that's an example where you begin with affection that just calls you into connection with those who you could be economically detached from. And in most of our economic relationships, we're very detached. If you had to become friends with everybody you have an economic relationship with, it would be impossible. But we can build affection. You can even build affection for people who work at your local HEB, and you see them again and again. And over time, you start to talk to them, and you know their name, and you can share pleasantries. And that may be all it is, but that builds some sense that I'm part of a wider network, and I actually kind of care about what's happening there. Like, I care that HEB better be giving them a fair wage, right? That matters to me in a different way. It's not an abstract thing. It's, oh yeah, Bobby, who works at our local HEB, who always talks to our kids when we come in. I really hope she's getting paid well or getting the benefits she needs. So then it becomes an issue that's real and personal and not just abstract. Other things come to mind as you think about how affection might be transformative, whether it's neighborhoods, whether it's in your church, economy, politics. Yeah, Walter?
So for me, as relates to our faith and the four loves, grace for me is God's love for me, not because of something that I've done, but because I am His. And so I'm seeing the connection then back to affection as kind of that other part of grace, which is once I've received that grace from God, then I think it is His call to me to extend that same grace to others, and isn't that what affection is?
Yeah, and it mirrors grace in a particular way precisely because of how it is non-discriminating, as Lewis described it in that first quote. Right?
Causes the rain to fall on the righteous and
The unrighteous, yeah. I keep thinking about how this potentially shifts our political landscape, because it seems very hard now to develop affection with those with whom we politically disagree. And so we're either in the posture of, we're in a friendship or we're in a relationship of eros that either we're in agreement, or if we're not in agreement, it's something we can't talk about, or we're strangers or we're enemies. And this space of affection seems to me a crucial set of bonds that need to be created so that political differences don't take on the sort of detrimental polarizing state that they've taken on currently. And I think, among many things, one thing that's missing is our capacity to just build affection, and really, it's not about building affection after the fact, it's about having a baseline of affection. So that when these differences emerge, you already have some affection that can allow you to continue to see your neighbor as this, right, curmudgeonly or, terribly off-center, political, crazy person, but
Less
they have
than a
some
jerk,
affection.
right?
But less than a jerk, and we have some affection, right? Like, oh my gosh, that's a so-and-so supporter. But we can still have some affection because we've already attended to building some kind of baseline. And it feels like, if we go back to Don Cheadle, we may increasingly be sort of structuring our world so that that kind of affection doesn't emerge very naturally. So that we're going to have to pay attention to it in a way that it might have emerged naturally when we had a different kind of social and economic and neighborhood relationship to each other.
It makes me think about the thing that Brene Brown says in Rising Strong, when she's talking about how you should assume at all times that people are doing the very best that they can. Right? Because, she says, it's when you do that that it becomes easier to set actual boundaries with people. Right? So she imagines a situation where there's somebody who tends to come to parties or, like your Thanksgiving dinner and then drink a lot and cause a problem. And if you believe that that person could do better, then you get really judgmental about them. But once you say to yourself, no, this person is doing the absolute best that he can, so you can't come to any more, right? I can't let you come here. Because
This is as good as
that's
it
it. That's what, but I don't have to be judgmental, I don't have to be dismissive, I don't think the person is terrible. Instead I can say, this is it, and if your best gets better, let me know, right? But for now we're gonna operate on this idea that that people are trying, and that people are trying to engage you in a real way, and that they're not just holding these political beliefs to be arbitrarily difficult, right? Or because somehow they know that it's really going to bother you.
So then we won't set up situations where we'll feel each other.
Right.
Yeah.
This reminded me of, Mike, your story about the person you knew who was a rector of a church, and that is, he purposefully made relationships with people around him, and when things got bad, that's where they went to settle things, because he had done that work ahead of time.
That's right.
That the relationships didn't start when the crisis hit, but the relationships had started prior. And so then there was this affection with each other, that they trusted one another to have those hard conversations.
Right. Yeah.
And that's I think politically, right? I mean, how do we? It's harder to feel affection when you feel you're completely an opposite, versus if you've had a base where you really have engaged those conversations and have found some commonalities ahead of time.
Right.
And then this you were like, you believe what? Oh, but I also know this other side of you. And so it's not this complete opposite.
Right.
No, I think that the political structures are definitely stealing class.
Yeah.
It's just separates you from this, because it's all a gigantic idea construct. And I've never touched an idea construct.
So then people become
Yeah.
just exemplifications of that idea.
Not an idea
Right,
construct.
rather than
There's
being
they're disincarnate real people anymore, and it doesn't help me. So in recent years, I don't know, maybe since my PhD work, I just stopped talking about politics altogether, because I just it seems so completely artificial in the context, so completely divorced from any kind of actual embodied humanity, that I didn't even care about my opinion anymore. I'm right. I mean, because what the hell do I know? I'm not some freaking informed international ambassador. But I don't know. I'm not a congressman, I'm not a senator, I've never been a president. I don't know how giant multinational corporations are putting pressure on me. I don't know how France and Spain are relating to me. I have no idea. So my opinion is pretty worthless. That's what's amazing is I'll get in situations like your family and man, they're sure that their opinions really matter. And so sometimes when I'm feeling asinine, I'll say like, well, where's your footnotes?
Show your work. I'm sure that.
I'm just listening to debates on TV.
Yeah.
I mean, so CNN supported this, or Coca-Cola that was advertising during that time. Hey, I'm just, no thanks, man.
Yeah.
But I'd like to get to know you.
Right.
Anyway.
Yeah.
I have two comments, and the first one is it reminds me very much of RCT as to, in terms of the model of connection, disconnection, and reconnection, is this idea of the central paradox. And what that is that in our need to connect so badly, we disconnect, and so that spirals us down to condemned isolation and behaviors that are still wanting to hold on to some connection, but we do exactly that, we just crash. And so that reminds me a lot, and so last week in class we talked about the election, but specifically, I'm not sure if y'all heard, about 2 years ago on NPR, they reported on a study they did between Democrats and Republicans, and the idea was that people were wanting to connect so badly, but they couldn't get beyond that because the underlying feeling was hate. They at the root of it, they hated each other because they couldn't have these conversations. So what they did, they had a study where they actually provided an incentive, which was money. And so some people were given money, some people weren't. And so the people that were given money, they were asked, you absolutely have to listen to the other side of the person, and you have to repeat what they said. And people who had that incentive were able to connect and say, oh, I'm able to see their side of the story. I'm able to be in their shoes. And the people who didn't have that incentive, they weren't able to. Again, there was that hate. And so that leads me to believe that there is that we can be affectionate, but we also have to put ourselves in scary positions, and that implies, really scary stuff. Interesting.
Yeah.
Scott, we're chairing a meeting in the next room, but.
Oh, and it started at 1:30.
Yeah,
Hey, everybody.
So.
Please fill out your evaluation form.